Hello and welcome to the Times Higher Education webinar, Using AI to Maximize Student Success and Lifelong Learning, held in partnership with Instructure. My name is Sridhu. I'm the Deputy Editor for Branded Content at THE. Before we begin, I would like to say that this webinar is being recorded, and we'll share an on-demand video and a summary article with all the participants after the webinar. We'll also be taking questions from the audience, so please use the Q&A function to post any questions you would like to ask the panel. I'm pleased to welcome to today's webinar Daniel Hill, who is the Managing Director for EMEA at Instructure, and Nicola Wilkin, Academic Director of Digital Education and Equity at the University of Birmingham. I will now hand over to Daniel, who is going to lead us through an exciting conversation about lifelong learning. Over to you, Daniel.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Sritu. Hello and good afternoon, everyone. As Sritu just mentioned, my name is Daniel Hill, and as Managing Director for Europe, Middle East and Africa at Instructure, it is my very great pleasure to be joining you today with an esteemed guest and panelist, Professor Nicola Wilkin. So Nicola, why don't you very quickly introduce yourself to our wonderful audience?
Well, thank you, Daniel. So I am by background a theoretical physicist, and through using digital tools in my teaching have become more convinced that it's the route to being able to personalize our student learning, not by necessarily just always buying the shiniest, but by creating something, an ecosystem, which now includes AI to enable our students' success. And particularly for students who are in a minority, where perhaps competency and confidence are out of kilter, these digital tools and now AI as well are an opportunity to really enable those students. And so that's my sort of background.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Nicola. I'm thrilled personally to have the opportunity today to be talking about this topic on using AI to maximize student success and lifelong learning. These are two topics that personally I am incredibly interested and passionate about, and as we well know from Nicola's description there, topics I know she has some really interesting stories to share and demonstrate just how important these things are in the future world of education. Before we get underway, I thought it would be worthwhile to just show at a high level how we're going to be navigating this rich and complex topic, and hopefully signpost throughout the discussion where and when we'll be talking about the different elements. So to kick things off, I'll take us through a high level overview of what lifelong learning means to me and my team, here at Instructure, as well as share some early insights from our annual State of Higher Education report for Europe. I'll share some interesting data points that we observed as part of our research efforts, and hopefully those will act as a catalyst for the discussion that Nicola and myself will have. From there, I'll invite Nicola onto the virtual stage, so to speak, and share some of her experience around lifelong learning, and specifically take some time to listen to some of the really great stories that she has to share around the impact that lifelong learning can have on all of us. From there, we'll look to Nicola to discuss how she's been able to work with artificial intelligence, and I know certainly a feeling that I've had even just in the past day or so, I'm sure a feeling that many of us have felt over the past few years. What obstacles has she had to overcome in order to get the very best out of this transformative technology? Following that, I'll share how Instructure globally, how we've embraced the use of AI with a reflection on the steps that we've taken over the past 2 years or so to ensure that AI has the biggest and, dare I say, more importantly, the most equitable impact on the learners and educators that use our technology. And then finally, we're going to wrap things up by opening up the floor to you, as Sritu mentioned on this webinar, and encourage you to ask questions of both myself and Nicola. So using that Zoom Q&A or chat that's at the bottom of your screen there, please do reach out, and time permitting, we'll endeavour to get those questions answered during the course of the discussion. So lots to cover, a really great topic to try and unpack. So let's jump straight in and let me talk a little bit about what lifelong learning means to us at Instructure, and more generally what its perceived impact is going to be on the world of education. So lifelong learning is defined as a continued pursuit of knowledge and skills for personal and professional development. And interestingly, whilst this term seems to regularly appear in all forms of educational media right now, the earliest use of that term can actually be cited back as early as the 1930s in the Frederick Post, which is I believe still a local newspaper, that's dedicated to covering the burning topics of discussion in the US state of Maryland. And whilst the term clearly has been around for a long time, as that timeline suggests, it is curious, I think, to observe just how often it's used and honestly the variety of different contexts to which it applies. I think there are several reasons why we've seen this topic emerge from a local newspaper in the US to now it feels an almost ever present in the strategies and goals for some of the leading educational institutions around the world. I think firstly, a growing financial pressure on the global workforce has meant, alongside a growing life expectancy for economically developed countries, that for the large majority of those currently working, there is now an expectation that they will have longer careers and by proxy a later age of retirement. And this is evident even in the UK, for example, where between 2010 and 2018, the state pension age for women rose from 60 to 65, so that it became the same as that for men. Between 2018 to 2020, it then rose again from 65 to 66. And now, with a new government coming into play in the UK, there is an expectation in the next year or so that that age will again rise to 67. So in an age of digital disruption as well, where new technologies, new business models, new ways of working with the emergence of work from home, the skills that were once deemed to be crucial to success perhaps are not as important in a forward-facing economy. And this creates an environment now where skills have a far shorter half-life, meaning that those professionals and learners who do want to continually thrive in this new world are forced to continually upskill and reskill. And that's an opportunity and a challenge for our traditional education providers. Given that rate of change, it's not uncommon for the skills that are being taught at the beginning of a traditional 4-year undergrad program to become outdated by the time that graduate is ready to join the workforce. And that situation is validated by a somewhat recent report that the Boston Consulting Group released a couple of years ago around shifting skills, moving targets, and remaking the workforce. And in that report, they shared that 1 in 5 skills requested for the average US job is an entirely new requirement in that occupation. So really outlining how the impact of technology and some other factors that I just mentioned are now extending beyond the typical fields that we believe are ripe for disruption. So think fields like IT, engineering, science, research. I think what this shows is that now any vertical, any industry is not protected from that disruption and change that we can all feel. Furthermore, in that report, it went on to state that 76% of jobs changed more from 2019 through 2021 than in the previous 3-year period, and that 37% of the top 20 skills requested for the average US job have changed since 2016. Facts like these show that this change and a need to think seriously about lifelong learning and a future skills economy is upon all of us. But it's not just educational institutions that bear the burden of this change alone. It is contingent on all entities involved in the delivery of learning that need to create an ecosystem where lifelong learning is possible. Sure, the education sector is responsible for the way that content and information is structured and absorbed by our learners, but it's also upon entities like our governing bodies to create funding mechanisms and ideally a unified skills taxonomy like we see in Australia, for example, from which employers can verify and draw down from. It's on businesses to ensure that there is a seamless link between the labour market and the curriculum that's being taught. And most importantly, at least in my mind and specifically for my role, it's on the technology providers that ultimately serve this sector to provide compelling tooling that removes barriers for those 3 other stakeholder groups to seamlessly interact. And in our own research at Instructure, we saw that belief verified with similar findings across the more than 1,600 students and educators that we researched across the UK and continental Europe. 72% of educators that we spoke to said it was important that a student uses the same technology across their educational journey, while 65% of students said they would use flexible learning options such as micro-credentials in the future. 65%, it's nearly 2/3, that's huge. That's the responsibility of each of us on this webinar and all of those stakeholder groups that I just mentioned, to ensure that all learners at all stages in their professional lives are able to access the development of the next generation of skills. Fortunately for all of us, we have the wonderful Professor Wilkin to share some of her experiences of how the University of Birmingham have been able to achieve this outcome. So with that, Nicola, perhaps I could ask you to unmute yourself and perhaps share your experiences of the impact that lifelong learning opportunities created at the University of Birmingham have had on some of your learners.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction, Daniel. So I think you've highlighted the why we should do this in terms of the changing workforce and the length of time that we will all be expected to be in employment in a role. There's a lot of concern as to how one finances this, who should be delivering it, when. What I'd like to concentrate on is the why, and the why for me from a personal perspective. So these are boot camps that we were running in the tech sector, so full stack and UX design. And these are just a few of the students who have shared with me their experiences of why they engaged and what they have gone on to do afterwards. So let me start with Carla Brown. So she joined us on the boot camp. And in fact, I would say all of them found it a challenging experience. And I think we shouldn't underestimate the challenge that lifelong learning has when we expect people to upskill significantly in a given area very rapidly. And kudos to all of those students that managed to do that, because it really is tough going and quite a commitment. So Carla undertook the UX program. So working in sort of user experience design, she's gone on from that to first of all create within Birmingham a network for Black Brahmin tech, in order to create that wider network, and has got 200K's worth of funding for enabling them within the music industry, all kick-started through that. Midaxa, when he joined the program, was working in an Amazon warehouse and is now gone on, and as you can see, he is working as a software engineer for Multiverse, and has also been very much working as a volunteer in sector, doing sort of coding boot camps on a voluntary basis. And then completely different sector, Claire had a sort of 20-year career gap, went on, took the boot camp, then took an apprenticeship with UCAS, so importance of these steps of building the lifelong learning, and is now working for UCAS, actually rolling out their apprenticeship program. So that just gives you a sense of the demographic that we can hit with lifelong learning and the opportunities that it gives both to individuals and to our national workforce.
Wonderful. Thank you, Nicola. I think a really important reminder for all of us, right, that need for lifelong learning has never been more evident. I love the story of Midaxa, totally transforming kind of his career trajectory as a result of, the steps and the learning that the University of Birmingham had made available to him. And, in my role, I'm very fortunate. I have the benefit of visiting a number of universities all over the globe, and having spent a good chunk of time at the University of Birmingham over the past few years, I really can attest to the way that this institution that Nicola obviously represents in this capacity, the way they support their learners that ultimately are trusting their futures to them, is world class. And I think these are just, I'm sure, a handful of the stories that I'm sure you could have chosen from ahead of this webinar. So I guess moving on just from the kind of description of lifelong learning and why it's important, I wanted to take a moment and integrate the topic of AI into this discussion. And I talked earlier during my introduction around skills having a shorter half-life than ever before. And ironically, AI is a wonderful metaphor for that environment, in that only a few years ago, most of us would have assumed that coding as a whole was a skill that had never been more important for a large chunk of the jobs of the future. But with the emergence of generative AI, those assumptions now have been very quickly shown to be somewhat misplaced. And this was evidenced not that long ago when Mark Zuckerberg shared on a pretty global podcast that he expects AI to replace mid-level software engineers before the end of this year. And that's validated in other areas also, right? With LinkedIn recently sharing in their Future of Work report, AI at Work, 55% of LinkedIn members stand to see their jobs change by the rise, I should say, of generative artificial intelligence, with 23% believing their roles will be augmented and 32% believing that their roles will be entirely disrupted. And the report went on to say that 75% of knowledge workers acknowledging that they use AI at work, with 78% of those users adopting a bring your own AI approach, given a lack of uniform policy at their company. And I'm sure there's any of us that have an experience in privacy or security just cringing at the idea that there are so many users that may very well be using that kind of approach. And, in summary, I think this presents a huge risk. And again, we saw evidenced in our own State of Higher Education report. 36% of the European institutions that our educators and students that we spoke to represented did not have AI usage guidelines developed, and that 44% of those surveyed lacked good understanding of generative AI. So even though the pace is moving so quickly, I think it's fair to say that there is still this uniform misunderstanding or, I guess, worry around how we can adopt this technology into our ways of working. So I think at this point, again, Nicola, I'd love to sort of hand back over to you, if I may, and just given your background specifically around AI as well as generative AI, some questions I'm sure that this audience would love to hear your input on. Firstly, perhaps we'll start off with kind of more generally, how are you working with generative AI at Birmingham?
So thank you, and that is a huge open-ended question. So I think, in the first instance, cautiously, we need to make sure that what we are doing is both equitable and ethical, which sounds glib in the first instance, but when you start sort of digging through as to what that might mean and what the impact could be for students, for staff, for the privacy of our data, there can be the first reaction sort of as a university might be to endeavour to lock everything down. However, if you do the lockdown completely, you end up in this sort of bring your own AI instance, and you are at risk of data leaking and being used unintentionally, supplied to various different other AI engines, which appear to be free to use. So what we have done at the university, and I know that this is a fairly common practice across the UK universities, is that we have enabled that all students and staff do have access to Copilot Web. They are encouraged to use that within their own, within the Microsoft tenancy, such that things are secure. And we have at the same time been very clear with the data privacy and the understanding of what it is that they being students and staff, risk to lose if they were to take things other than perhaps their favorite recipe and further by using it on other engines, be they in the US or elsewhere. So I think that's the first piece. There then is, once you've done that, and I'm sure we'll come to assessment in a moment, there is the where can we enable it to help us? And I think there is the the brainstorming piece, I think that is great for everyone. And in particular, it can help you in finding what your biases are potentially when you're thinking about a topic. So it gives you that, bouncing your ideas off. Have I really given something a 360 view? Or do I just think I have? And I think AI can be really good in telling you that there are places that you need to explore. We've doubled down very much on making sure that everybody knows what sources they've used, how they've referenced it. And in that sense, Gen AI is no different. And then it's that educating to be curious. So we expect students, staff to be curious in their everyday outside of Gen AI. The same should be true within Gen AI. But I think the biggest challenge, and the one that perhaps is the hardest from an academic perspective, is to realise that although I'm the academic, they are my students, the information is coming to all of us at the same time. And it's an understanding that the difference is that perhaps we have that critical thought attached to our particular discipline, and it is then co-creating what the future looks like together with the students and really empowering them with that critical thought and how to go about thinking about this latest piece of news, because there always will be. And at the rate things are going, we can expect yet another large piece of news and a change in Gen AI, certainly within the next 6 months. So you spoke about sort of tool skills expiring fast, and with that, the half-life, that I'd be in agreement with. But the skills of curiosity and understanding that rigor, that will be a constant of the motion.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, really, really well said. And, it's about how we can educate to use the tooling and the technology to ultimately, make the hybrid merge of AI and human intelligence better than just AI on its own. And I guess kind of linked to some of the areas that you said around helping people understand just what they are potentially giving up as part of using this technology. I think specifically it would be useful to understand from you, what guidelines have you implemented to help defend against some of those risks that certainly I've mentioned, and I know that you've mentioned during your pieces there?
So I think we started out in a defense mode when Gen AI came on the scene. And it very much, I would describe it as a sort of King Canute phase where we went through we do not want the tide to come here and we are going to lock down everything. And, we will just say, don't use AI. That was perhaps the initial knee-jerk response. We now, we will work. The things we have implemented are consistent with sort of the Russell Group guidelines. And actually, if you look across globally, those exist across the piece. The ways that one enables fairness, and fairness includes ensuring that for a cohort that we know that all students have done their own work, because otherwise there's an unfairness to those that didn't cheat. A lot of that comes into making sure that assessments really are authentic to the particular discipline, and furthermore that they have a variety of assessments across their program. And particularly in technical disciplines where perhaps there are steps to the learning which perhaps the AI could do, but you need to be able to demonstrate you can do those, because otherwise you will not have the sort of technical ability to be able to do the further pieces which Gen AI wouldn't be able to guide you to do. In those particular instances, sort of actually we get back to a place where in-person exams become the easiest way of ensuring that fairness and ensuring that we haven't got an inequity because different students have got access to different tools paid for compared to others. And actually, we had, particularly in the technical disciplines, I guess we had that wake-up call during COVID, where we found that there were engines that were enabling students to submit the exam questions in real time, even in timed online exams. And so that had the advantage of setting us up for knowing what Gen AI in essence democratizes the essay mill, which has existed for a long time. So in a sense, we just need to tighten up, but those bits were problematic already.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a couple of things there that I think are really interesting and kind of lead on to my next question to you in a way is that I do think that that lens on assessment specifically is quite a good example of how people responded globally to AI. And you very honestly shared that initially you went into defense mode, and I think that was kind of the education sector at large, right? It all went into defense mode, and particularly around assessment, I think there was this initial demand for how do we check when the AI is being used, and how do we kind of stamp it out of our assessments? And I think as we've started to get more familiar with this topic and ultimately preparing learners to be ready for work and ready for the next phase of their careers, it's less about have they used AI and more about can we assess how well they have used the AI in an appropriately structured assessment. And I guess that leads into this next question around, from your perspective, Nicola, what responsibility do we have to ensure that we are preparing students for an AI-centric world of work, and how can that kind of bleed into the way that an educational institution thinks about maybe assessment or other aspects of the student experience?
So if I can just go back on one thing you just said there, I don't think all assessments should have AI included.
Sure.
It just needs to be clear how
Yes.
you are allowed to in each one, and
Yeah.
some won't at all. Just
Yeah.
in order that we
Absolutely.
have
No, I think we're in agreement for sure.
yeah. So we have the same challenge in getting students ready for AI at work that we do sort of with the broader where AI is moving. So depending on the size of the company and the industry that students will be looking to go into, the sort of disruption that AI is causing is to a sort of greater or lesser extent. And particularly actually the sort of the smaller to medium-sized companies perhaps are really playing around with this because it has such a large leveraging effect on the efficiencies that they can have. And a lot of those things are back office, and they're going to be tools, and they're going to be tools that will evolve very rapidly. So given that, it's not going to be a yes, I can use tool X, because tool X might not even exist at the point of graduation, but it's I know how to use and become familiar with a new AI tool. That I know that I need to be able to play with it. I understand the sorts of how to check that the information that I'm getting back makes sense. So it's really that sort of the logical thought, the prompting, and being able to work with a set of different engines and just being critical at each point. And I think being able to be critical within your discipline and being able to sort of do that sense check of any answers and being willing to play are probably the biggest things that we can give in enabling our students to be AI ready. And then that alongside making sure that they have a sense of the ethical awareness, both in terms of bias and also sustainability. I mean, at the moment, you could ask ridiculous questions of Gen AI, and they would go off and happily affect, the carbon footprint. You could do simple addition and ask Gen AI to do that. Well, that's clearly ridiculous, and we will get to a more nuanced place where people are thinking about, I could do it with Gen AI, but is that the sensible thing to do? Where sensible includes things like sustainability.
Yeah, interesting. I think that's a really interesting point that, you know, I'm not sure many of us really think about, is that just the downstream impacts of you using these tools, and kind of bringing it back to what you said around the augmentation of AI plus, you know, the human condition, for want of a better phrase. That's almost what we need to be able to accurately assess and encourage development in. Is, you know, yes, it's all very well that you can perhaps use the tooling, and, you know, it's almost the layer below to say, well, why would you perhaps use AI versus why wouldn't you use AI, because of those, you know, downstream impacts that you mentioned, which is, I think, a really, really interesting idea and question that I'm not sure a lot of, certainly, students at this stage are probably thinking, because it feels like there's a, you know, this magical tool that can help them in all aspects of their work, which is fantastic. I'm thrilled to say that, obviously, as we've been talking, I can see we've had a number of questions come in. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to now move into sort of wrapping up the kind of formal presentation, and I think we owe it to this crowd to make sure that we're answering some of the questions that come through. You know, I think what's really refreshing whenever I talk to, you know, experts like Nicola is, our belief at Instructure is that we also share that responsibility. Right at the top in my introduction, I shared that it's, in our opinion, it's not just educational institutions that have to, you know, wear this burden, they have to carry this load. It's on all of the stakeholder groups that are there, and as a result, as it pertains to AI, we also, I think, share that responsibility in terms of how do we make sure that technologies like AI are being adopted and utilized in our ecosystem in a really sensible and meaningful way. So I thought it would be appropriate, just before we go to the question and answer section, to just kind of close the formal presentation by sharing the ways that in Instructure we are thinking about this technology in our ecosystem. And I remember when AI kind of first entered the mainstream, as you can imagine, myself and our wider business were under a huge amount of peer pressure to try and embrace this revolution, to realize all of these wonderful benefits that generative AI could provide to our wonderful community base. One of the things that I'm most proud of, however, is before we even considered including AI in our tech stack, we were absolutely steadfast in our belief that it was a measured and sustainable approach to AI that ultimately would end up being the most successful one. And as a result, despite various competitive pressures, we've created our guiding principles towards AI policy. And really what they do for us internally is they act as our own internal governance mechanism. And I think you mentioned, Nicola, in one of your responses, it prevents us from being too quickly drawn towards flashy features and slick sales presentations. And I'm sure all of us on this webinar have been party to more than a few of those since generative AI has hit the mainstream. But instead, we wanted to make a commitment to our community that we were prioritizing academic integrity, that we were prioritizing student data privacy, and obviously, and as I say, dare I say more importantly, the accessibility and equity to the results that AI can achieve. And these principles, you can see them on the screen here, they are freely accessible online, and they actually helped inform one of our very first quote unquote releases called AI Nutrition Facts. So the thinking here is that, similar to the way that more and more of us nowadays are checking the labels of the foods and drinks that we are consuming before putting them in our shopping trolley, we thought it was important to create a standard through which we can very quickly and clearly communicate the LLM, or large language model, which is what AI fundamentally relies upon. What LLM is being used when AI is surfacing in this part of our ecosystem? Not just the LLM though, what data is that LLM trained on? And that data, does it contain PII, or personally identifiable information? So being completely transparent to you as educators in terms of what information is being used to surface these incredible results. And once we'd established those commitments to our community, we were then able to start rolling out what we felt were really powerful technologies and tools. So everything from smart search tools, so we can have canvas our ecosystem, understand the theme of what you're searching for in a course. So let's say you're in a fine arts or maybe a music course or module, and you remember an example of someone perhaps playing a violin. our smart search can allow and understand the context of that search. And so rather than just looking for the word violin across a variety of file types, perhaps I'll broaden that to stringed instruments without necessarily asking the user to do so. It may bring up guitars or double basses or whatever it may be. Or, another piece where we see things like this, and this is ironically what the nutrition fact on the right-hand side is pertaining to. Ask your data, where you can enter a very natural language question into your environment, and then we can, using AI, convert that natural language or question to a deeply technical or specific query of your database without the usual requirements of things like SQL queries or programming information. So I think to wrap all of these topics up before we get into the Q&A, I think it's fair to say that it's obviously a challenging and an ever-changing world that our learners and educators are walking into. Now, of course, this webinar isn't going to provide you all of the answers as to how you can use AI and how you can maximize student success and lifelong learning. But if nothing else, what we're hoping this will do is give you some demonstrable examples of what success could look like for your learners, as well as give you some well-placed guidance on the ways in which AI can be used in a safe and sustainable way. So with that, would love at this point to go back to our audience and perhaps talk about some of the questions that we've seen come through as we've been going through the presentation. And one of the first ones that I can see that have popped up here, and again, Nicola, would love to get your thoughts on this. What trends or developments in digital education more generally are you most excited about, and how do you see these shaping the future of education?
So I think genuinely being able to personalize learning for a student within whatever program they are taking is the thing that I have been wanting to do for at least the last decade. And there have been slightly clunky ways of doing that in the past, but now with generative AI, we're going to be able to sort of assimilate a student's prior learning, even within our own sort of degree program, so within the data stack that we hold, and be able to sort of indicate areas that might be of additional interest, as well as places that perhaps they might want to go for sort of revision and support prior to taking new courses. And so I think that personalization piece and really leveling off this sort of confidence versus competence piece that I have been conscious of and researching for a while, that can happen in quite large cohorts of very able students, where you find that perhaps that they join us at university never having had to actually ask a question in the classroom at school because they were always on the leading edge. So
Wow.
this personalization can both enable students to perhaps catch up or work through, but it can also apply that stretch in individual areas that they may be interested in for further research or careers.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I think personalization is one of those areas I personally am most excited about technologically. I think, again, that's why it's really important we get some of those guardrails in place, because the personalization is, of course, reliant on processing a certain degree of, personally identifiable, in some instances, data. So again, I think that's why that scalable approach is so important, because if you can make sure those guardrails make sense, the possibilities are endless, but they're being done in an equitable fashion. So I agree. I think there's a tremendous opportunity, again, for all stakeholders to kind of play a part in how we can improve that experience. Another question that came through was, in your role, Nicola, how do you ensure that new technologies such as generative AI or virtual learning environments are implemented in ways that promote equity and inclusivity rather than exacerbate existing inequalities? Try saying that 5 times really fast. There we go.
I think even once was clearly going to be a challenge for me. So I think part of this is having trust with the partners, commercial partners that you are working with. So for instance, the nutrition sort of facts that you have there, that set a test to demonstrate that there is an infrastructure that you can rely on with the additional tools that you are going to plug in. And it's going for what are the foundational pieces of a tool before you ask, can it definitely do what I want it to do? Because if you aren't sure about the sort of the data security and the links through, that's key.
Yeah.
And then the piece that we have been working on quite extensively at the University of Birmingham is that we realised that, and I don't think we are alone in this, that we had quite a complex ecosystem, and we were giving access to all students to these tools. But if they came from schools or home backgrounds where they had not had access to much tech and the sort of the time and the encouragement to explore, we could actually exacerbate the digital gap in a space that we couldn't see it. And that in effect, we were giving additional help to those that had already come in competent.
Mm.
And so we're being very careful about making sure that we signpost all the opportunities, and that one of the things we're in the process of setting up are AI bots that will act for the signposting and suggest tools and opportunities as we see where students are in their workflows.
Yeah, great. And I think I might use this as a good segue to kind of go further into that almost digital equity piece. In that, another question was, has the University of Birmingham worked with government bodies, businesses, and technology providers to improve digital equity, which I think is kind of linked to what you were just talking about?
So I think we are influencing partly in sort of our purchasing strategy and in the partnerships that we are creating in order that we understand what equity looks like, and actually those hidden pieces where it's completely unintentional, but you end up creating a gap that was unnecessary.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. I can see the questions are still flooding in as we go through the presentation. So I'm conscious of time. I think we've probably got time for maybe 2 or 3 more before we wrap. What I'd like to do is, I think, whilst for those questions that we're perhaps unable to answer on the call today, we'll of course keep a record of the questions that you have, and certainly we'll do our utmost to respond to those, maybe in a asynchronously environment, to give you some further engagement based on the content that you've seen today. Another question here, again, perhaps linked, sorry, to that idea of equity. Can you share more about how the University of Birmingham ensures equitable access to digital education for all students, particularly those from underrepresented or disadvantaged backgrounds?
So ensure is probably, I think strive for might be a more reasonable aspiration.
Yes.
I think the challenge is that there are many tools that you could buy now as an individual student. And we certainly, with an open checkbook, we would perhaps offer a whole range of Gen AI tools, all of them sort of ring fence such that we could enable the data to be secure. That's unfortunately not practicable. So what we have done is to ensure that students have access to, for instance, the Web Copilot, and then they have access to all of the strong baseline, are more than sufficient to do what they are required of their degree.
Yeah.
And I think that keeping that threshold line, in place as things move forward is going to be the challenge, and one that we will be watching and responding to.
Absolutely. A couple of other questions, Nicola, if I may. How do you cater to distance learners and learners with disabilities? And maybe if you have any either examples or processes that you've been able to implement as part of that, perhaps.
So distance learners get full access to all of the software that we
Right.
have in place for our in-person students. So there's equity from that perspective. The signposting becomes even more critical, particularly if they're asynchronous. And then the sort of the assessment piece, again, that has to be really authentic and relevant to the program. And so I teach on a program which is designed for learning environments. We make sure that the assessments that are in there, so we go through sort of all the way from design thinking to sort of digital artifacts for education. In all of the cases, we're making sure that the experts, they're often experts from industry, that they're able to bring the skills and the knowledge that they have into the assessments such that they are authentic, and sort of that is the best way that one can AI proof.
Yeah.
So that's a little strong, but it also is the most relevant for them, because that again is more of a lifelong learning type. People are taking it because it's relevant to their industry.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, I mentioned at the top again, right, the macroeconomic pressures on students, I think, are now making that need to cater for the distance learner, or the short course, or the micro credential, ever more present. As unfortunately, I think the path to higher education or further education is increasingly more tricky. And I think that's really, again, both the opportunity and the challenge I described earlier for educational institutions, in that there is an opportunity to address that need. But it's going to take, technology is part of the problem of a big challenge. And yes, having great technology is part of it, but it's certainly not the answer. And I think, some of the teaching that you do is crucial to how any institution globally can start to address that market. One final question before I hand the proceedings back over to Sritu. Just finally, Nicola, what other strategies have you found most effective in closing the digital divide among students?
A lot of it is working in partnership with students. We won't understand what the digital divide is. We can hypothesize what it might be, but we actually need to make sure we keep working with our students, really listening at all opportunities, and then assimilating that information to see if there are potentially gaps that we haven't realized that are emerging. So it's being available to listen at all times and then take action.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a wonderful sentiment on which to wrap things up. So before I hand over to Sritu, I just wanted to take a moment to recognise and thank Professor Wilkin for all of her input and her time and diligence in not only presenting today, but also preparing. We've been obviously talking and working with Nicola for some time, and the time you've dedicated is not taken for granted. So thank you for this, and thank you kind of more generally for the work that you're doing in this space. I think it's really exciting. We need thought leaders like you pushing the barriers and pushing the boundaries of what can be done and what should be done. So again, thank you for all of your work and efforts in that area. From my perspective and on behalf of Instructure, thank you all to the attendees and those of you who have been able to join us over the course of this webinar. This for me is, again, as I said, a really interesting topic, and something that I think we're going to continue to see grow and develop over time. And we're thrilled to just have a chance to participate in that discussion, right? So thank you all for your time and effort. Sritu, I'll hand back over to you for any closing comments that you might want to add.
Could I just thank everyone for taking the time? I know, diaries are incredibly busy, so thank you.
Yeah,
thank you for all the amazing questions.
Yeah, thank you. Over to you, Sritu.
Thank you. Thank you, Nicola and Daniel, for this very engaging and informative conversation, and also for sharing those resources. Thank you to all the participants for joining us today and contributing to the discussion. We'll share the recording of this webinar and a post-event summary article with you in the coming days. Thank you once again, and goodbye.